Hello, everybody. My name is Kim Dorman. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Princeton Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you all here this evening. I just wanted to make a note that if you would like to take advantage of live transcript at this stage, you can click in the menu on the bottom bar of your screen, and that will immediately enable live transcript. We are delighted to, when Lynda Oppenheim from Not in Our Town approached us to ask the library if we'd like to partner for this event. And it's my great pleasure to introduce her as she introduces this evening's program.
Thank you, Kim. Good evening. My name is Lynda Oppenheim. I'm a member of the board of Not in Our Town Princeton, a local racial justice organization. Because we believe it is important in our work to recognize the full, true, and sometimes hard history of the United States, we begin by acknowledging that there were people living on this land before the arrival of Europeans. The land on which we are living is part of the ancient homeland and traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape people. We pay respect to Lenni Lenape people past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in their homeland and in the diaspora. We also acknowledge the millions of enslaved Africans and their descendants on whose backs this nation was created. I also want to acknowledge the organizations and faith communities that co-sponsored tonight's event. Their names are listed on the screen. It is my pleasure and my honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Elise Boddie. An award-winning legal scholar, Elise Boddie is Henry Rutgers Professor and Judge Robert L. Carter Scholar at Rutgers University, where she teaches constitutional law, civil rights, and state and local government law. Her award-winning research on how dynamic systems perpetuate racial inequality bridges diverse disciplines and practices of scholarship, teaching, community, and service, and has been broadly cited and recognized in both academic and non-academic circles. Perhaps not as widely known is the high regard in which Professor Boddie is held by her students, one of whom called her a kick-ass professor. Important for our concerns about educational equity is Professor Boddie's role in the lawsuit Latino Action Network versus New Jersey, which challenges segregation in New Jersey public schools. After Professor Boddie's talk, Professor Lynda Dodd, who has taught most recently at Princeton University School of Public and International Affairs, will offer comments. I especially appreciate Dr. Dodd's contributions to the equity efforts in the Princeton Public Schools, bringing to our attention, among other things, racial equity impact statements. And now, I'm happy to switch the Zoom focus to our esteemed speaker, Professor Elise Boddie.
I had to unmute myself. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for that warm introduction, Lynda Oppenheim, and thank you also to Dr. Dodd for offering remarks and comments. I'm eager to engage with her at the end of this, this discussion. So I'm going to share my slides. Hold on just a second, bear with me. Okay. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. So the title of my presentation to you today is Struggling for the Soul of Public Education. I'm just going to draw quick attention to this photo. I was looking for a picture of racially diverse public students, and it's really hard to find them. And so I actually opted for this picture of my son's classroom on a field trip to Philadelphia. So just a footnote on the source of the picture. So first of all, what do I mean by the struggle for the soul of public education? And I define this as the struggle to achieve a pluralistic, integrated public educational system in which people from all backgrounds share power, engage, and learn on an equal footing. And there's the question that I want to just explore, which is really how racial segregation undermines public education and also undermines our democracy. And here I'm drawing on the really significant, fantastic work of Elizabeth Anderson, who's at the University of Michigan, a MacArthur Genius Award winner, and her book, The Imperative of Integration. And what Dr. Anderson talks about in her book is how racial segregation undermines democracy because it divides us into distinct, non-interacting groups, such that we are not attuned to the interests of the whole public, in which each is regarded as equal to the others. So we are separated from one another. And I would add here that because we are separated from one another, because we do not have the opportunity, or children do not have the opportunity in racially segregated schools to create the habits and sentiments of association on terms of equality, we tend to mythologize about how people in those other schools are, right? Children develop the habits of thinking as people outside their schools, as outside their zones of interests, outside their spheres of justice and equality. And that's dangerous to our democracy, because it means that we don't develop the habits and sentiments of association on terms of equality. We learn to fear one another. It undermines trust. It encourages sort of a sense of the other as an unknown. And we create these mythologies about people who are not in our public schools, in our public spaces, as being different from us in ways that undermine our ability to relate to them and to care for them. All right, moving on. So I want to share with you, this is from the brief that was filed by the American Federation of Teachers in Brown versus Board of Education. And I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes here talking about the harms of segregation, in particular to white children. There's a lot of discussion in educational circles, in the public spaces, about the harms of segregation to Black and Brown children. But what's underappreciated is the harms to white children. And it's interesting that there were actually a number of amicus briefs, friend of the court briefs, that were filed in Brown versus Board of Education that spoke to these harms. And I just want to share a little bit about what some of these briefs said. So again, this is from the American Federation of Teachers. And the brief refers to the deep-rooted evils that teachers see in a segregated system. The system results in inferior educational facilities for the Black child and deprives him of an important element of the educational process. And they note here that the damage to the Black child is material, both as to quantity and quality. The damage to the white child is more subtle. In a moral and spiritual sense, he is corrupted while the other is corroded. And the material advantage that the white child has is purchased at the cost of an uneasy spirit. I also note here that in a case in Roberts versus City of Boston, which is a challenge to segregation in the Boston public school system, Charles Sumner, who was a radical Republican in the United States Senate, argued also about the harms to white children. And he said that white children who are taught in segregated schools are nursed in the sentiments of caste, right? Going back to the point I made just a moment ago about how children who learn separate and apart from one another don't develop the habits and sentiments of having associations on equal terms. And so the danger to the white children is that they become acclimated to caste. And so we can see that from a relatively early period, there really was a lot of sensitivity, at least in certain circles, to the harms that segregation posed to white children. There was also a brief that was filed by social scientists in Brown versus Board of Education. This was a brief that also spoke to the harms of segregation to Black children. For those of you who are familiar with Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court decision mentions nothing about the harms to white children. It only focuses on the harms to Black children. But I thought it was interesting to share that what the social scientists said was that white children learn the prejudices of our society in segregated schools. And when they learn the prejudices of our society, they are taught to gain personal status in an unrealistic and non-adaptive way. When comparing themselves to members of the minority group, they are not required to evaluate themselves in terms of the more basic standards of actual personal ability and achievement. So they don't have to, white children aren't accustomed to having to compete with children who are different. And so again, because they are segregated from one another, they come to assume that they are superior without the benefit of having to engage with other children who are not like them. So I want to say a little bit here about the harms to white children, the democratic harms to white children. And I'm going to sort of set this up by talking about a Supreme Court decision, or I should say a Supreme Court case, Cooper versus Aaron. And some of you may know that Cooper versus Aaron was a procedural and highly technical case, the thrust of which was whether a federal court order approving a desegregation plan at Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, would be suspended for 2.5 years because of the extreme civil unrest and the very, very serious threats of violence to the Black children who were integrating Central High School. And the picture that I have here is of the members of the 101st Airborne escorting the 9 Black children into Central High School in September of 1957. And then because of the extreme threats of violence that they faced, the question was whether to suspend the school term for 2.5 years. As some of you also may know, just by way of background, when Black students, the Little Rock 9, were set to enter Central High School in September of 1957, white mobs descended upon them. The governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, dispatched units of the Arkansas National Guard to prevent them from entering into the school. Eventually, President Eisenhower dispatched federal troops to protect them, and the students went to school that year, but it was, as you can imagine, a very difficult year. And once again, because of that, the following year, the Little Rock School Board wanted to delay further implementation of the desegregation order. The state of Arkansas was engaged in this campaign of massive resistance fomenting violence and instability at the school and tried to block the use of federal troops. So the school board had argued, circling back to the case itself, that allowing the school year to proceed under these conditions would compromise public education. What's interesting also about this case is that Thurgood Marshall, who at the time was head of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, and would later, as many of you hopefully probably maybe know, would become a Supreme Court justice himself, argued the case. And I want to play a clip of the argument for you. Let me just see if I can. Hold on a second. Oh wait, did I click on it? Okay, so hopefully you will be able to hear this.
We should balance equities. I never have agreed as lawyers.
This is Marshall.
Balance personal equities against constitutional rights. But even if you go into the so-called, what petitioners call equities, with all of the problems that the children went through in that school and the faculties, democracy is tough. There's always going to be a measure of difficulty and problems. The school board is so worried because they get threatening telephone calls and letters. I don't believe anybody ever in public office that was worth the salt and make a decision one way or the other didn't get telephone calls and letters. That's a part of service to democracy. I don't welcome it, but I recognize it. But I think we have to think about these children and their parents. These Negro children that went through this every day. And their parents that stayed at home wondering what was happening to their children. Listening to the radio about the bomb threats and all of that business. I don't see how anybody under the sun could say that after those children and those families went through that for a year to tell them all you have done is gone. Fought for what you consider to be democracy and you lost. And you go back to the segregated school from which you came. I just don't believe it. And I don't believe you can balance those rights. There's no question here of the right of one group of children against another. The other side constantly talks, and indeed Judge Lemley talked, about the injury to education. It's according to what type of education we're talking about. In our brief, I think it started around page 8. We quoted from the decision in the Brown case, in the West Virginia against Barnett, and the argument of the Solicitor General 2 weeks ago as to what education is. Education is not the teaching of 3 R's. Education is teaching of the overall citizenship, to learn to live together with fellow citizens, and above all, to learn to obey the law. When we talk about public education, we think from those 3 quotations there, it's clear that's what we mean. And the damage to the education in Arkansas and in Little Rock and in Central High comes about through the order of Judge Lemley, which says that not only the school board and the state can and should submit to mob violence and threats of mob violence, but that the federal judiciary likewise should do so. I don't know of any more horrible destruction of principle of citizenship than to tell young children that those of you who withdrew rather than to go to school with Negroes, those of you who were punished last year, the few that the school board did punish, come back, all is forgiven, you win. Therefore, I'm not worried about the Negro children at this stage. I don't believe they're in this case as such. I worry about the white children in Little Rock who are told as young people that the way to get your rights is to violate the law and defy the lawful authorities. I'm worried about their future. I don't worry about this Negro kid's future. They've been struggling with democracy long enough. They know about it. This is actually laid.
It stopped, Elise?
Yes. So now I'm just trying to return to my slide. Wait, did I close out of it? Sorry. There we go. Okay. Can you all see the slide?
Yep.
Okay. So I played, the 3-minute clip because I did want you to hear Marshall talk about his concern for the white children, and he says he's not worried about the Black children. They've struggled with democracy long enough. And I should note that the transcript is a little bit off. Some of you may have noticed that it's not quite an accurate description of what Marshall is saying. But I just want to note a few quick points. He says that education is not just reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? It's not just the 3 R's. It's the teaching of citizenship. It's the teaching of citizenship so that children and eventually adults learn to live together. He says it's tough. It's not easy. And I interpret him to say that democracy cannot function. The voices of the people cannot be heard if people build walls and close themselves off to the world around them. And then again, he says, I'm not worried about Black children. They have struggled with democracy long enough. And he doesn't exactly explain what he means by that. But I interpret him to mean that the Black children, the Little Rock Nine, were engaging in the project that Elizabeth Anderson described of trying to build a shared community, a community that shares not only resources, but power and opportunity, that once again seeks to cultivate the habits and sentiments of association on terms of equality. And the question is, what are we teaching white children when we allow them to opt out of that project? Given this country's history, we are schooling them, again, to return to Charles Sumner, in the habits of prejudice and uncharitableness, and to nurse their sentiments of caste. Okay, so again, this is the Little Rock Nine. This person right here is Carlotta Walls, who I had the good fortune of being able to meet a few years ago. Carlotta Walls Lanier. That's just a point of personal privilege that I wanted to share this picture. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the struggle in the South between extremists. I don't know if you all, if I'm blocking the title, there we go. Given what was happening in Little Rock, Arkansas, there's this battle in the South between the extremists and Southern moderates. And what's interesting is that there was actually at the NAACP, there was a struggle between the NAACP, who of course was litigating Brown, and moderate, quote unquote, moderate Southern governors, sort of over the framing of the debate around school segregation. And Southern moderates very much resented the extremists, the folks who are fomenting massive resistance, because it was sort of creating a narrative of sort of very bad people who were sort of upsetting the civil order. And many Southern governors, actually there were Southern governors who preferred sort of the more moderate path, but they didn't prefer the more moderate path because they were interested at all in school desegregation or integration. They preferred the moderate path because they were trying to evade Brown. And I mention this by way of an eventual analogy that I want to make to what's happening in New Jersey and in other parts of in other northern jurisdictions now. So there's this really interesting, wonderful book by Anders Walker called The Ghost of Jim Crow, how Southern moderates used Brown versus Board of Education to stall civil rights. And the tactics that they used are along the lines of what I have described as adaptive discrimination, the idea that even though we may have formal laws that bar certain activity, that people try to maneuver their way around formal law and to basically reconstitute racial subordination through other means. And that's essentially what these sort of Southern moderate governors were trying to do. Reva Siegel at Yale Law School has referred to this as preservation through transformation. You transform the system into something that looks different, but is actually substantively the same. And so some of the tactics that were used by these Southern governors were to move away from the use of overt racial classifications in assigning students to public schools to these seemingly race-neutral standards-based criteria to make assignment decisions in public schools in ways that would continue to perpetuate racial segregation. They also relied on racial propaganda. They stereotyped Black children, Black people as being sort of poor academic performers. There's a lot of talk around morals and illegitimacy in the Black community. And they played to sort of a sense of community welfare, white community welfare and white health in order to undermine school integration. They also reinterpreted Brown or encouraged the reinterpretation of Brown to emphasize de jure versus de facto segregation, which is eventually what happened. Some of you who may be familiar with Dr. Martin Luther King's work, who talked about the difficulties with white moderates, he did so in a slightly different context, but it was related to the civil rights era. And he says that he's been gravely disappointed with the white moderates. He's concluded that the Black people's greatest stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not sort of the extremists, not the Ku Klux Klan, the White Citizens Council, but he says it's the biggest stumbling block is the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another person's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time and constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. And he says shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. And I mention this by way of also prefacing my remarks about New Jersey and the frustrations that I'll share a bit later about where we are in terms of the efforts to challenge school segregation. All right, so a couple of quick doctrinal points. Many of you may know this. So in law and constitutional jurisprudence, equal protection jurisprudence, there's a very important distinction between de jure versus de facto segregation. I mentioned just a moment ago that there is this effort afoot by Southern moderates to reinterpret Brown or limit Brown really to de jure segregation, meaning segregation that was either required or encouraged or tolerated under law, versus de facto segregation, which is basically sort of segregation. It's been interpreted as segregation that can't be traced to a specific intentional source. It just sort of happens, although that description, I think, is very deceptive. This distinction between de jure and de facto segregation becomes absolutely critical in a later case, a later Supreme Court case, Milliken versus Bradley, which was decided in 1974. Milliken versus Bradley was a case that came out of Detroit, Michigan. You had, this was a period of white flight from Detroit, Michigan to the outlying white suburbs. Black people were not able to move into the outlying white suburbs. And so there was a case that was brought basically challenging segregation within the Detroit public school system. And the district court judge issued an order that said, we will desegregate, and we will desegregate across jurisdictional lines, meaning that the judge created a remedy that essentially extended beyond Detroit to the outlying suburbs, and that would basically allow schools to integrate across jurisdictional boundaries through busing. That order was eventually struck down by the United States Supreme Court in Milliken versus Bradley, and the court said, you cannot require race-based student assignment unless there is a finding of intentional discrimination, de jure discrimination. And so Milliken versus Bradley is really key for understanding northern segregation and why it's still so persistent, because Brown versus Board of Education didn't fully apply outside of the South unless you could tie it to showings of intent to discriminate. As hopefully many of you know, the reason why jurisdictional borders figure so prominently in the problem of school segregation in the North is because of redlining referring to the practice of the federal government that essentially disinvested in any neighborhood that had a single Black person or undesirable, quote unquote, person in it. The federal government would refuse to insure mortgages in neighborhoods that had a single Black person. They would literally create a map. They would take out a map and draw a red line around those neighborhoods, which is where the term redlining comes from. So anything that was marked red was a place that would not receive federal backing of private mortgages, which created a huge disincentive for people to move into those neighborhoods, led to very bad zoning policies that further disinvested in those neighborhoods. And meanwhile, while Black neighborhoods were redlined, you can see from these maps, there were other places that were identified as being very healthy for investment and support, these white neighborhoods and communities that did receive federal support. And because of that system of disinvestment, we have tremendous wealth that is concentrated in white communities and tremendous poverty that is concentrated in Black communities. All that being said, there were still very there's intentional segregation in the North, and these are some ways in which Northern segregation was perpetuated by gerrymandering attendance boundaries, using optional attendance zones, selective transfer policies, site selection, and construction. and overcrowding Black schools and under-enrolling white schools. And those devices were subject to sort of legal censure. There were cases that actually found that this was unconstitutional, because it could be traced to specific actions by school boards, although those cases increasingly became fewer and farther between. I don't know exactly how I'm doing on time. I want to make sure I don't.
It's 6:33.
Okay, so I'm just going to skip through this. So the consequences of, oh shoot, sorry.
Okay, we've been telling you about Tanya McDowell. She's the single homeless mother who stands accused of stealing her son's public education.
Sorry.
Tanya McDowell is a Connecticut mother jailed for what authorities call.
Okay, I didn't actually mean to play that. So let me see if I can get through. Okay, so Lynda, so am I out of time?
No, if you want to finish up, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay. So really quickly, New Jersey, we have some, we actually, despite the fact that we're intensely segregated, we're the 6th most segregated state for Black students and the 7th most segregated for Latino students. We actually have some tremendous law that I'm not going to read through. I'll just say that it's primarily honored in the breach. I'll highlight very quickly here that there's a really fantastic case, Booker versus Board of Education, that articulates a very broad vision for public education. It was way ahead of its time. It talks about social emotional skills, citizenship, participatory democracy, the disadvantages of homogeneity. There's a lot of great decisions in New Jersey, in the state Supreme Courts about school segregation and why it violates the state constitution, which is the basis of a case, Latino Action Network, that was filed a few years ago, actually, this coming Monday. I'm going to stop there. I can say more about the case in Q&A, but I don't want to eat up all the time. So thank you all for your attention, and I look forward to having the conversation with Dr. Dodd.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation and thoughtful presentation. Professor Dodd will be offering a few comments and reflection, and then there'll be some conversation. And I just wanted to note that to our participants, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Doddie, for this talk and all the work that you're doing in New Jersey, including with the Latino Action Network litigation. And thank you so much to Kim and Lynda for inviting me to offer a few short comments. Most of the questions I have in mind concern what success looks like going forward, particularly in places like Princeton. And I've organized these brief comments in 3 categories. So first, there's the challenge of changing the hearts, minds, and actions of the more privileged parents. What can move parents to expand their sphere of concern beyond their own children? And I really appreciated, Professor Boddie, that you included some quotes about the interests of white students. And I would note that in the Latino Action Network litigation, there is a white student plaintiff from Highland Park, New Jersey, which I think is important. So regarding this issue, I'm thinking of residents in New Jersey towns who protest or express resentment regarding inclusionary zoning or apartment developments in their towns. This is a big issue, as many of you know, in New Jersey due to the impact of the Mount Laurel litigation. Second, thinking ahead to some of the possible remedies in the Latino Action Network litigation, and perhaps Professor Boddie can discuss this during Q&A. Some of the remedies that are possible that are mentioned in the complaint include regional controlled choice programs, which would not be voluntary and would encompass students from multiple districts in a county area. There could also be inter-district desegregation transfer plans They could be mandated by a court or through legislation. They could have financial incentives, but they also could not. So what are the prospects for backlash as a result of a settlement or a court decision in this case? And third, I'm thinking about the need to build coalitions that will join forces to ensure segregation does not continue to occur within schools. So for example, regarding this issue of segregation within schools, I'm also wondering about effective measures to ensure racial equity in diverse, well-funded public schools in places like Princeton or in Shaker Heights, Ohio, outside of Cleveland. There's a wonderful lengthy profile in the Washington Post from 2019 about racial equity debates in Shaker Heights. There's also another great book by Amanda Lewis and John Diamond called Despite the Best Intentions, which concerns the same issue. So in particular, I'm interested in hearing from Professor Boddie her thoughts about these challenges. I don't think the litigation addresses this in particular, but the need to hire more teachers of color, which is a real challenge in New Jersey, strengthening the quality of the curriculum, particularly in the elementary years. This is a much bigger topic, but I'll just briefly mention good work that is being done in places like Baltimore, which has recently switched to a knowledge building ELA curriculum for the elementary schools. And also in Oakland, California, there are parent advocacy groups like REACH and the Oakland Literacy for All Coalition that are doing good work. What about abolishing all tracking in schools to eliminate this within school segregation, such as ending gifted and talented programs, moving to school-wide enrichment programs instead, which Princeton Public Schools has done, as well as universal access to AP classes, which Princeton Public Schools has not yet done. Last, but by no means least, what about ensuring that there's access to expensive extracurricular and enrichment programs? Here in Princeton, we have private organizations like the Princeton Children's Fund. They do try to help with these fees, but as a trustee of this organization, I know full well that they need private donations to help ensure that all students have access to these opportunities. These inequities with respect to extracurricular activities and tutoring, I think as a legal matter, could be also the school district's responsibility. So in 2014, the Obama administration's Department of Education Office of Civil Rights, OCR, issued a Dear Colleague letter regarding school resources and explained that Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 obligates that disparities in access to extracurricular activities be considered. And more recently, the Biden administration's new Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General, Pam Carland, has emphasized the need to reinvigorate Title VI enforcement in general. In terms of New Jersey's state constitutional law, in the Abbott litigation, which many of you have heard of, it deals with school funding. The state Supreme Court referred to supplemental programs and extracurricular activities as part of the state constitutional obligation to provide what the Constitution provides, a thorough and efficient education to all students in New Jersey. Finally, I'm interested in your thoughts about what counts as success from the student's perspective, especially because the title of tonight's talk is Reclaiming the Soul of Public Education. So what about the feelings of often severe alienation that students of color express, even after they've entered integrated schools and they've achieved at the highest levels according to all traditional metrics? So I wanted to include a student's perspective in this discussion. I'd like to share anonymously and with the permission of the student, a brief passage from a Princeton University student's essay that was written for a class that included a number of books related to tonight's talk, including Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, and Bettina Love's book, We Want to Do More Than Survive. So in this essay, the student starts with some comments about affirmative action, and she ends with a call for abolitionist teaching. So I'll end my comments with a few quoted excerpts. Placing Black bodies in white spaces does nothing to address structural racism and classism that permeate the education system. Black students are being taught how to shrink themselves to fit into the confines of whiteness and white success. Affirmative action only encourages this by giving a small number of Black students access to elite institutions with the caveat that they might find success or financial stability in their future. The student author then notes a study from Johns Hopkins showing that, quote, Black students have negative perceptions of their campus climate due to racial and ethnic hostility, inequitable treatment, microaggressions, isolation, tokenization, lack of representation, and overt racism. And then the student goes on to say that campuses are not changing their climate to include Black students. They're photographing Black students at disproportionate rates in order to make their schools appear diverse. Black bodies are not cared for, they're not loved, they're not valued in academic institutions in America. Black people do not benefit from affirmative action in the way this country likes to believe. We cannot uplift Black and brown students by telling them that they need to leave the people they love so that they can find success by sitting in a room with white people. Black women in predominantly white institutions are constantly being burnt out from the daily experiences with racism and misogynoir, academic rigor, and the always looming expectation that they need to bear the burden of fixing this country. And then the student ends this essay by calling for abolitionist teaching. And she had just read Bettina Love's book. She says, the abolitionist teaching network cannot change the education system by itself, but organizations and schools can follow their model. They have teaching guides, freedom schools, resources for agitators, and advice regarding radical self-care. Abolitionist educators are leading the way forward, and we should listen to them. So that's the end of the students' excerpts. For me, the students' powerful words remind me of language. I know Professor Boddie knows this case. A historic 1968 Supreme Court opinion, Green versus New Kent County, where the Supreme Court ordered Southern school districts to desegregate root and branch. And that phrase reminds me of the students' comments. Root and branch indeed. Thank you, Elise, again, and I'm looking forward to your comments.
Thank you. Thank you for those comments. And this is going to sound like a cop-out, but had I timed my my presentation differently, I could have gotten to the other slides that address many of the issues that you've raised, including the Green case, which I lay out in a slide. But I won't dwell on that. So let me address the concerns that you've raised, and this is you know this is a complicated issue, and I recognize that very, very sincerely, not only because of my own personal experiences going through schools that were some that were integrated poorly and some that were integrated more successfully. I've seen or I've benefited from positive integration policies, and I've sort of suffered under tokenism and integration policies that were done poorly. And so I really sympathize with the students' points. Let me I'm gonna get to the specific questions that you raised around sort of what success looks like. Let me just say a few words about sort of backlash and white resistance. Yeah, that's not, I litigated some of these cases in the South. I've done civil rights litigation. I understand about the possibility and potential for resistance. And, you know, I think one of the things that I just like to say about this, and it sort of feeds into the points that I was making earlier about democracy and how we conceive of education. And we conceive of education almost as a form of property, right, rather than as a common good. We think of it as a commodity that is to be sort of bought by, purchasing our way into various neighborhoods. We're not focused on sort of collective well-being and public belonging. We have a very consumer mentality when it comes to public education that's focused on maximizing opportunity for our children, not other people's children. We don't care about other people's children. And the clip that I accidentally started playing, and I would have liked to have played more, was about a Black woman who was arrested for enrolling her children outside of her zone school district, was arrested and prosecuted for larceny, so literally for stealing public education. And we have the same kind of mentality in New Jersey because we have, first of all, so many different school districts, 600 plus school districts. If you add in charter schools, we have these very teeny tiny districts with very intense borders. We, school districts around the state of New Jersey employ what I call the residence police to have to verify the residence of children. And because we, so much of our funding, our school funding comes from our property taxes, state law incentivizes this. So the purpose of the litigation is to challenge the provisions within state law that more or less require students to attend school where they live, to sort of move past this border focus on where we send our children to school. So some of the resistance, hopefully, not hopefully, some of the resistance is fueled by the way that we structure our public school system and the way that we incentivize resistance because of sort of the focus on paying for much of it through property taxes. Let me just also say that I deeply understand that this work has to be done in coalition with community groups, students, faith leaders, all kinds of different constituencies and stakeholders. And let me just also clarify, I'm not litigating this case. I'm not a lawyer in this case. That was, very intentional on my part. Though I do, help to advise the lawyers from time to time. But because this work is so complex and challenging, and so alien to so many people, that there has to be a time to sort of till the soil, to sort of to help people become adjusted even to the idea of segregation. That's been quite a journey. When I first started this work almost 5 years ago, when I talked to people about school segregation in New Jersey, they thought I was insane. And now I'm proud to say that 5 years later, there's much more awareness, I think now, not just due to my own efforts, but also due to the coalition partners I've worked with. So we are working with Salvation and Social Justice, a group of faith leaders around school segregation. We're working with young people. We actually had an 8-week sort of educational activity through Salvation and Social Justice, my own project, and Latino Action Network, where we brought in high school students from all over New Jersey and had them talk about their experiences with school segregation and the harms of segregation. So when that work actually will continue and will be ongoing. That being said, sort of going back to the students' observations and commentary, we know that there are good ways to do this and there are bad ways to do this. And I've alluded to some of the bad ways already. Some of the other slides I was going to show were intended to address, Dr. Dodd, some of the points you raised, which is, again, if you recall the point that I started with, which is how systems replicate themselves. So you think you've tackled it, and then it moves to another domain. Segregation within public schools is exactly that problem, right? That it replicates systems of entitlement within the public schools through, as you've identified, gifted and talented programs, tracking, excessive discipline, even the framing of the language in terms of how we talk about Black students, which is laden with assumptions of inferiority, are incredibly harmful. The relatively few Black teachers, we've lost many Black teachers in New Jersey for a whole other set of reasons that we can talk about. So there has to be a lot of, there's got to be a ground game around this. I don't think, and I'm just speaking for myself here, there's some good things that can happen through litigation, but I also think that because this is a system created this, we need a system to address it, which means that we have to deal with legislation, I believe. We also have to be very intentional about engaging with communities to bring pressure to bear on school systems to make sure that they do right. So we need community organizers, we need parents and caregivers to be involved in this work. It's a very significant undertaking. I have no illusions about that. Let me just make sure that I'm, so in terms of the remedies, I hope we get to that stage. Again, we'll see. The case is in the trial courts now. There's still some discovery that's going on. Hopefully we'll see movement by the end of this year, but that can't guarantee that. Most of the, well, actually, let me say, I'm not going to presume what the remedies would look like. My own view is that a remedy would be designed through very significant consultation with people around the country who have done this work. It has to be a remedy that is both structural in terms of how you design school systems, how do you draw the school district boundaries, if you draw regional boundaries, and then create schools within those boundaries, build schools within those boundaries that are focused on equity. And I do make a very, I should make I want to intentionally distinguish between desegregation and equitable integration. In the point that I'm about to make, desegregation is the removal of the legal barrier. Equitable integration is a more affirmative frame that focuses on how do we build systems of equity along the lines, Dr. Dodd, of what you mentioned and sort of what I've alluded to in my my comments over the last several minutes. So if you create equitable integration in public schools and give students the opportunity to attend those schools, I think that we can get to a better place. The question of how we actually get there is, again, it's a combination of courts and legislation. I think, do we, just go into your specific points, how do we change hearts and minds? I think that's a huge process, right? That's a question. People fear the unknown. So there has to be, I would say we have to have dialogues with different communities around the state, right, to sort of help them understand, to bring them into the process, would be my way of pursuing it. There, you identified a number of different ways in which school integration, school desegregation has been pursued. I can answer more about that in the Q&A. I think, oh, and then finally, let me just say something about funding, because that does come up quite a bit in these conversations. So we have terrific law in the state of New Jersey around school funding, and David Ciara, who leads the Education Law Center and sits on the board, for diverse and inclusive schools that I helped to form. We're right on the same page with this. Funding is absolutely essential to this this project. And we know from research that you have to have, in order to build the most equitable schools, you need funding, you need good preschool, and then the third piece of this is integration. And I'm referring here to Rucker Johnson's book, Children of the Dream. The problem with relying solely on funding, because again, I'm anticipating some of the questions that might arise, which is, let's just fund the schools equally, right? Let's fully fund the school funding formula, and we'll be good. And the problem with that is that it's, that's essentially separate but equal. That's Plessy versus Ferguson. Separate is I don't want to say never, because I'm a lawyer and I want to be careful, but separate is rarely, if ever, equal. And the other thing about funding is that you do rely on the will of politicians in order to fully fund public schools. So funding is essential, but it's not alone. It's not enough. We also need to make sure that we bring students together in the building. That was actually the theory of Brown versus Board of Education. This is the last thing I'm going to say, right, in this colloquy, that there was an effort before Brown versus Board of Education to try to ensure that schools were funded appropriately and equitably for Black children. The problem was that those cases had to be litigated again and again every year, because as soon as you'd secure funding for a school, the school district would pull back. And so what the lawyer said during that time was that it was like emptying a swimming pool with an eyedropper. And so the theory behind Brown versus Board of Education was that green follows white, meaning money follows white children. If you want Black children, and in this time period, it was focused on Black children. If you want to provide equitable funding to Black children, put them in the same schools with white children. Okay, sorry if I've run over time.
No, not at all. Thank you so much. I will never cease to be amazed at the way that people can respond when 6 minutes of comments have been offered and you just respond to everything. It's always amazing to me. We have a variety of questions in the chat, and I'm going to try and consolidate them a bit here. One of the first questions is, how necessary is district consolidation to integrating schools, given how many small districts there are?
I think I consider it a very attractive option, but again, because I think that, one of the difficulties is when you have these teeny tiny school systems, it just gives, it increases opportunity for people to evade school integration. So I think ideally there would be regional systems to promote school integration, but those would have to be very carefully designed. Again, I have no illusions about that, and they would have to be done in conversation with the communities that are being affected. But there are also other ways to do it, and Dr. Dodd mentioned some of them: interdistrict choice, which has been okay in some contexts. The more expansive the remedy, the better the integration outcomes. Interdistrict choice is a more modest remedy, but it is available.
Some questions are quite specific. One of the questions is, as our town gets more diverse, I've noticed that our small local school is now more diverse on paper, but within specific classrooms, there's a clear pattern of inequity. Have any lawsuits addressed segregation at the classroom level?
Not that I'm not state litigation. I know that there have been the U.S. Department of Education Office of Civil Rights complaints. I think with regard to special education in particular. I know in Montclair we had an OCR complaint. But I'm not aware off the top of my head of any other complaints.
I have two questions that I'm combining. One part is, why did Black teachers leave New Jersey? And the other question is, generally reflecting on a specific incident at a school where students complained, and the board's response to the hiring, that the teachers should reflect the student body. The board's response to this hiring request was that there was not a large enough pool of qualified personnel to make personnel changes. How do we address this challenge? Is it an accurate assessment or merely an excuse?
So I can start, and Dr. Dodd, if you have other thoughts, please. I don't intend to monopolize this this conversation. I think I want to sort of take issue a little bit with the framing of the question around, why did Black teachers leave New Jersey? I don't know personally that that's an accurate description. I do know that there have been, let me just preface this by saying, I've had so many conversations with people about this issue over the last 5 years, and a consistent theme of those conversations for when I talk to educators is that there are significant barriers to entering the teaching profession, sort of the volume of tests that have to be taken, the cutoff score for, I guess, the GPA to get into some of these teachers' colleges. The curriculum in some of the teachers' colleges leaves a lot to be desired. I think we have to think really, really hard about whether the barriers that have been constructed to enter the teaching profession really are correlated with what we need good teachers to be. I'm very skeptical that just because you perform well on a test that you're necessarily going to be a good teacher. We also need teachers who love Black and brown children, as well as Asian children. I mean, we need teachers who care about the welfare of children, and so. Though we have to look very seriously at the systemic issues, the systemic barriers to entry for teachers. I feel like there's another component to your question, and I'm not sure I have addressed it.
The other question was just mentioning something that happened at Chatham High School, where students and graduates testified at a school board meeting demanding changes in the selection of curricular materials and recruitment of personnel more representative of the student population. The board's response to the hiring request was that there's not a large enough pool of qualified personnel to make changes. How do we address that challenge? Is it an accurate assessment or merely an excuse?
Yeah, so in terms of personnel, I mean, I would just say that we need to, in terms of the numbers of Black teachers who are being certified, I think that the numbers are low because of what I understand to be the barriers to entry to the teaching profession, which are not necessarily, as far as I can see, correlated with actual skill and expertise. But let me just say another thing, and that sort of bears on the point that Dr. Dodd made and that I alluded to earlier. The role of students in these conversations is absolutely essential, and which is, the reason why we've brought in high school students, and although we created the opportunity for them to come into these conversations, they're kind of running it. They decide like the terms of their participation in these conversations, but they're the ones who, students are the ones who are most directly affected, right? And so we need to listen to their voices. And I think when students press for change in their schools, when they say, we want better, right? We want a system that is, more equitable, fair, that creates opportunities for us to come together and learn from one another. I mean, that excites me to no end. So I say that, any students who are out there and listening, fight for what you believe is right, and and hopefully, change will come.
Thank you so much. I feel like that's a perfect place to end, but I do want to offer Professors Boddie and Dodd the opportunity to offer any closing comments if you'd like.
I'll let Dr. Dodd go first.
Well, you know, I do think Not in Our Town Princeton is doing wonderful work helping to educate families across the town about these issues. So not only did they help sponsor tonight's event, but they have conversations and meetings throughout the year. And I hope more parents and students join them.
Yeah, I'll just echo that. I'm really grateful to have you know, partners in this work and to have organizations that are involved in agitating, and I mean that in the most positive possible way for change, because it doesn't just happen by wishing it was so. You have to make it happen. You have to create demands and then you know, act upon them. And so I'm grateful for all the work that you are doing. It's making a difference. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you tonight.
Professor Boddie, Professor Dodd, all the partners on this program, thank you so much. And thank you so much to all the participants who came this evening. Have a wonderful evening.